Chapter 25. It seemed like hours to Cale as Nev and Darren navigated the Gren's caves. Every second drew Ayianna closer to death. By the time they had reached Remoja, green streaks of poison stretched like spiderwebs across her neck, face, and arms. Cale rushed after Darren through the ruins and into the old courtyard as the eastern horizon began to lighten. The crumbling walls shadowed a handful of tents. Dawn's silence enveloped the world in a false sense of peace. A layer of frost lined the stones and crunched underfoot. The mountain air already tasted of winter's first breath and stung Cale's lungs. Darren strode toward one of the tents and ducked inside. Cale and the others piled in after him. In the shadowy recess of the tent, he could make out a single cot and a lump of someone snoring softly. "Saeed!" The elderly elf scrambled to his feet and grabbed the falling blankets from his shoulders. "What is the meaning of this? Yatako Ithaisa!" A light sprang up in the center of the tent, and Cale blinked in the sudden brightness. A small globe, much like the one he had, chased away the shadows of the tent. He glanced at the others. Filth and blood covered their faces and clothes. Darren's presence filled the tent as he hunched over, cradling Ayianna against his chest. Her face was deathly pale, her lips blue. The green web-like streaks spreading across her skin darkened to black and stretched down her arms to her fingers. He shuffled forward, the back of his shoulders brushing the canvas ceiling. "The girl has been bitten by the Harpy Lord." He laid her on Saeed's now vacant cot. "She is nearing death." "Harpy Lord?" Saeed pushed Darren out of the way. He bent over Ayianna and pressed his fingers against her temples. He cupped her chin in his hand, turned her head, and inspected her wounds. "Darren, get Nerissa. She might have enough coolant to save her." Darren stepped out of the tent and the flaps slapped back into place, but not before a draft of cold air slithered over them. Cale shivered and pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. He stared at the young woman before him, her breathing shallow, her skin hauntingly green. He prayed, hoping he hadn't failed again. Before Cale could get lost in his thoughts, Darren returned with a merwoman. Her white braids were swept up into a tousled bun above her ridged forehead. She gathered her grey robe, knelt down, and examined Ayianna's wound. She inspected her arms and legs. "Why did you bring her here? The venom has almost completed its task." She glanced up at Darren, her eyes as cold as the icy rivers of the north. "Stand ready in case we are too late." Cale clenched his jaw as anger burned in his gut. How dare she reprimand them for trying to save Ayianna's life? Were the merfolk so heartless? How did she find him? Nerissa shook out her satchel and grasped a dark bag. From it she slid a vial. Is he not confined by the perimeter? Cale exhaled his mounting tension and told her what had happened. Nerissa's fingers brushed against the small puncture wounds on Ayianna's neck. She uncorked the vial and dribbled the contents into them. Cale held his breath as the liquid fizzed and sizzled. Holding her hand over Ayianna's forehead, Nerissa closed her eyes and spoke in her native tongue. "Naweli ako namalihi, ako pawako lahule ekayekoi. Nawei lipiaihi kayo kalehi. Naloka wa lihi lakipe maloho. Lewapahohi kaiwo meiko mawa. Lekipikehi." "Another blanket, please," Nerissa said, her voice fluid and soft. Vian yanked one from his leather bag and handed it to her. "Is she going to be all right?" Cale crossed his arms and leaned closer. "We will not know until evening. By then the coolant may have consumed the poison and restored her body. If we were not too late." Silence hung on her words. She must stay warm and observed. If her condition worsens, give her 3 more drops of this. Nerissa rose and handed Cale the vial. "Will her neck remain scarred?" Desmond rubbed the back of his neck. Nerissa paused at the entrance of the tent and faced Desmond. "Cursed wounds never heal. If she survives, she will have more than a scar to worry about." Cale twisted the vial in his hands, the weight of his failures suffocating him. He needed some fresh air. He handed the vial to Desmond. "Wait a minute, what about my ear?" Desmond lifted his hands. Cale clenched his jaw. "What about it? It's not going to kill you." "Those claws weren't exactly clean." Desmond glanced up at the prince. Vian stepped back. "Don't look at me. I'm not cleaning it. If you'll excuse me, I have some questions that need answers. I'll put in a word about your ear." He grimaced. What's left of it. Desmond's eyes narrowed. He turned his back to the others and sat down next to the cot. Cale took one last glance at Ayianna and followed Vian out of the tent. They made their way across the courtyard. Smells of blended herbs wafted from a black pot bubbling a few feet away, reminding him he hadn't eaten in days. Or was it? He rubbed his tired face. Leora and Eloise fluttered past, carrying a loaf of rye bread between them. "Rabbit soup! It's a couple of days old, but it will fill you," Leora said. She and Eloise placed the loaf on the table. "Darren, can you bring the bowls? Be careful, they are hot." The half-giant grunted. "One mother was enough for me." "Tisk!" Leora fluttered into the air. "Would you rather I serve it cold?" "Nobody likes cold soup." Darren strolled over to the small fire. Moments later, he returned with 3 steaming bowls. He handed them out and sat next to Cale. Cale nodded his thanks and sloshed the chunks of potatoes, onions, and rabbit around in his bowl. His stomach growled. He closed his eyes and reveled in the pungent smell. Food, even if it was soup. Nevin Said reclined at the table and toyed with his braided beard. Even though he just woke up, he had already donned his traveling cloak, a knapsack, and his sword. Did he expect trouble so early? Next to him sat Nevin Unai, Said's deputy headmaster and the only teacher who survived the massacre. Aside from Darren, he was the only other guardian eating. Eldwin sat across from them, rigid and dressed in fine embroidered silks. The Usamor elf could have passed for royalty or a pompous noble, but Cale knew better. He had been a good friend to his father when he was still alive. Lazar, the only Haruzo this side of the desert, conversed with him. His lithe form draped over his chair with feline grace and casualness the other guardians lacked. He was also the youngest of them. Nerissa sat adjacent to Lazar with the content of her satchel spread out before her, minus the vial of Kulin. She replaced them in their appropriate pockets. A few conch shells, a worn journal, and an inkwell remained. Toward the back of the courtyard, the stout dwarf kept to himself, scowling as he sharpened his battle-axe. His bushy brown eyebrows furrowed even more as he concentrated on the rhythm of his wedding stone. Out of all the guardians, Adrian was the busiest, being responsible for 3 dwarven clans. He was also the most stubborn, at least according to Said. Cale had yet to work with him. Cale tore a chunk from the loaf of rye and sopped up the remaining broth. Behind him, Leora and Eloise spoke in hushed tones, their voices like delicate chimes singing on a breeze. If he listened long enough, he'd certainly fall asleep. Said cleared his throat. "How did you end up in Nganjo?" Cale finished chewing the bitter bread. What was he going to tell him? That he strayed and allowed his companions in the forest to sway his thoughts? He knew he should have stayed on the Najiso trail, but he didn't. Why? He could blame Desmond. He could create reasons and explanations, but none of it mattered. He glanced up at Said, expecting to see fury in his amber eyes, but instead they held compassion. Cale sighed. "I failed to stick to the trail." "Quite an adventure, I hear." Said motioned toward the ferries. "In failing, you succeeded. Interesting how it all worked, no?" Cale frowned. "How did Darren know where to find us?" "Eloise told us you have fallen into the tunnels, most of which lead to Nganjo." Said twisted a braid between his fingers. "I had suspected the enemy of using those old caves. When we were down there, we saw people in chains. They were present, but yet they weren't." Cale folded his arms and leaned forward. "When Ayianna tried to touch a young woman, she said it felt like she stuck her hand into hot porridge." Said's brows knitted together. "That is peculiar indeed." He stroked his beard and leaned back in his seat. "We recognized some of the people. They were from Badera." Cale glanced at Vian and returned his attention to the headmaster. "Ayianna saw her mother." Said tugged on a braid. "If I am not mistaken, the people you saw are connected to the spell the dancers had cast." He glanced at Unai. "What do you make of this curse? Have you come across anything like this in your studies?" Unai finished his last bite and smoothed the few strands of hair he had left across his head. "Well, did anybody see how the curse was actually performed? Was blood involved?" "I didn't see any blood," Cale said, "but during the festival these dancers chanted and danced in the inner courtyard. One of them had a pronged staff. The longer they chanted, an orb of energy began to form and grow brighter on the tip of the prongs. But that's all I know. I grabbed Ayianna and jumped into one of the pools of water. Unai raised an eyebrow. Interesting. I doubt I would have thought of that, but nevertheless effective. Then what happened? Kale shrugged. Later we saw the dancers give a man called Dirk a goblet, and he made a toast. I didn't sense any other spells, except when he called down fire to consume the Book of Tharin. Then they hailed him as king. Unai scratched his ear and leaned forward. If what you saw underground were the souls of the people influenced by the dancer's spell, then I would assume the Plains people have been placed under the Twamart curse. It binds people's souls, locking them into eternal bondage and servitude to the curse's source, or seed as we call it. It appears, Unai turned his attention to Saeed, that Samin has chosen Dirk to be the seed. Then it is as I feared. Saeed ran his fingers over his braided beard. Samin has tainted her soul with the breath of the Toaz de Kon. The guardians grew silent. Kale glanced around, and they sat there staring at the table. But before he could speak, Vian coughed. What exactly is the Toaz de Kon? Saeed eyed the prince. It is a pity when the future rulers of Nalu do not even know their own history. We will all pay the cost of ignorance. Eldwin snorted. Speak for the humans. We in Zuriel see to the education of our people. Badera seeks to educate its citizens of what they need to know and not in fanciful philosophies. Vian lifted his chin. I, on the other hand, have been instructed in such knowledge, but I've only seen the Toaz to be nothing more than words to scare people, to give meaning to the meaningless, an assumption to hang all of our fears, unmet desires, and dreams. Well spoken, Saeed nodded. For many people that is true. But tell me, does your experience in Nganjo suggest otherwise? Perhaps. Vian held the headmaster's gaze. As High Guardian, what do you say the Toaz de Kon is? Apart from what I have witnessed, I speak only from what Karasi the Sacred Pearl has revealed. The Toaz de Kon is the tainting of the gifts the Shadow God had bestowed upon his servant Taitha before she rebelled against Zohar. The Queen of the Underworld? Vian fell back in his chair and shook his head. This gets more convoluted as we go. Do you actually believe that? Saeed smiled. Where do you think Samin got the power to bind the souls of the people? So what you're saying, then, is that the Toaz de Kon is power to do one's bidding? Not exactly. Saeed tugged at a braid. It is a power to a certain extent, but overall it carries out only one agenda. Taitha's, who would like nothing more than to defeat the Shadow God. The prince eyed Saeed. I have to agree that something is at work here, but to be honest, I'm not sure what it is. Fair enough. So how do we break this curse? Vian raised his hands. There must be a way. Unai scratched his round belly. Some people can fight it, like Saeed did, but most do not have the strength on their own to withstand such a spell. If I remember correctly, there is a tonic called Dwalu. When a cursed person drinks it, he or she receives clarity and the ability to overpower the bindings of the mind. Vian's eyes narrowed. How do we find this tonic? Well, that's the problem. Unai raised his hands in a half shrug. All the scrolls and tomes of the Guardians have recently been destroyed or stolen. Someone else must have it. Vian glanced around the table. His gaze settled on Kale. What about the elves? Before Kale could say anything, Eldwin spoke. No nation has been granted privilege to the Guardian's sacred knowledge. You can't be serious. Vian's face flushed. His eyes sought the headmaster. This is ridiculous. How has the Guardian Circle ever helped Nalu? You hide away in the north as the nations go about their business. You do not care whether they succeed or fail, and now when Nalu needs you, you don't have the answers? Calm yourself, Saeed said quietly. You do not know. You do not fully understand the situation. Vian stood. I am Prince Vian of Badara. My father is missing, his kingdom overthrown, and his subjects cursed. I want to see action on the part of the people who call themselves guardians. Kale tore his gaze from Vian's red face and glanced at Saeed. The headmaster studied the prince. His amber eyes blazed clear and focused. His presence carried so much wisdom and strength. Didn't Vian see that? The plight of your father and the plains people has been duly noted. Saeed raised his bushy eyebrows. But action based on insufficient information brings about inferior solutions and at times greater problems. Vian clenched and unclenched his jaw in the prolonged silence. His glare softened. I'm not that big of a fool to go rushing into something unprepared. Vian sat back down. So what do you suggest? Saeed, Leora fluttered down to the table. I know where we might find some information about the Tonic. Remember when Najira appointed the first guardians? Perhaps you were still too young, but the chieftain of the Haruza hosted the guardian circle for centuries until they built Dagmar. Saeed nodded. You are right. Then we shall send someone to Bonzapur. What about my father? Vian asked. Darren stretched his legs out beneath the table. He is in the dungeons. Then we should free him. We cannot go marching into Badera right now. The half-giant adjusted the leather eye patch and leveled his remaining eye at Vian. We must have a plan. Then let's make one, Vian glared at the guardians. Be patient, young one. Leora glided over to him. You of all people know the formalities of ruling a kingdom. The guardian circle oversees much more. Kale shifted in his seat. The lack of sleep and a full stomach pulled at his eyelids. Couldn't they finish the conversation later? Saeed let go of his beard and stood. So where does this leave us? Laura held up her hand and counted on her fingers. First, we have the attack on Dagmar, the thievery of the vault's contents, and the kidnapping of the sacred pearl. Second, we have a missing king and a curse. Third, I think it is safe to say that Samin and Dirk are behind it all. Have I left anything out? Saeed shook his head. He clasped his hands behind his back and paced the hall. Wait, what about the people after Ayianna? Kale's gaze followed him. Maybe they're connected to all this. It is difficult to tell. Saeed's forehead furrowed. Had Kale detected a slight shake of the head? Saeed shrugged. Perhaps when she wakes she will have more information for us. Do you believe the attack on Dagmar and the happenings at Badera are related? Vian asked. Perhaps. Saeed tugged at his beard and continued pacing. If you ask me, Unai glanced at the prince, Samin obviously discovered the curse in the records Imaran stole from the vault. He turned his attention back to Saeed. If you would have listened to me and had those scrolls destroyed, we would not be dealing with this. I support your theory that Samin is the culprit behind the attack and the curse. But, Saeed shook his head, his voice thin and tired, knowledge in and of itself remains neutral. It is what we do with it that makes it dangerous. Ignorance will bring us to greater ruin. Yes, Kale said, and with knowledge comes responsibility. Spoken like a true elven lord, Eldwin clasped the table's edge and dipped his head. Your father would be proud. Kale bowed his head momentarily. May he rest in peace. As guardians, Saeed faced the table, we have the ultimate responsibility to the Shadow God for the care of the nations. If Samin and Dirk are employing the Toaz, we can assume that their plans are influenced by Teza. He glanced around at the others. I do not think they will stop at the plains. What are you suggesting? Eldwin leaned forward and braced himself on the table. That each of you return to your respected cities, inform them of the threat that gathers in the plains, ask them to take up the Alliance colors once more for the sake of Nalu. That's it? That is your plan? Adrian's mustache jumped with each word. Will not happen, Lazar shook his head. The Highlanders have severed ties with Nalu. The dwarves care nothing for the plains people, Adrian stood. Their kind has brought it on themselves, I tell you. First the empty religion of the Nuja, and now this. True enough. Eldwin nodded his head in agreement with the dwarf. Man has chosen the path of Ereshel. We should leave them to their demise. Saeed's gaze wandered over the guardians' faces, flickering for a moment on Kale's. We cannot. We have the prophecy to consider. Kale cocked an eyebrow. What prophecy? The others remained quiet, their gazes locked on Saeed. The headmaster retrieved a tattered old book from his knapsack and flipped it open. The morning stars shined in the dark, blinding the sighted. Tremors shook his gnarled hands as he held it open. Death and her loyal subjects defeated, but in shadows they remain. Twice more Zohar's star will shine, but let not death find him, nor the dagger. So listen well, guardians of Nalu, guard the dagger that in slewing released the star, lest they be found and the enemy unbound. Saeed closed the book and returned it to its knapsack. Kale glanced at the others. Pensive scowls etched their faces except Nerissa. She reclined, her angular face smooth and calm, her eyes closed. Prince Vian merely raised his eyebrows and shrugged. You have read only part of the prophecy. Unai's fingers brushed a pendant hanging from his thick neck. Is there not something about the shield of Chai and the 9 stones becoming one? Yes, Unai, you are correct. But the perimeter stands strong. We are not in the final days as of yet. Saeed clasped his hands together and sat. But I believe Samin and Dirk are taking it upon themselves to usher in the end of Nalu. Bah! Adrian shuffled over to the table. What evidence do you have? Saeed cocked his head. Have you not been listening? What of Dagmar's destruction, the kidnapped pearl, and the overthrow of Badara? Perhaps, but how do you connect them to the prophecy? Adrian folded his arms over the butt of his battle-axe. Mostly rumors and speculation, but at this point we need to at least consider it. Kale rubbed his face. How long was this meeting going to go on for? He had more questions than answers, and the need for sleep buzzed in the back of his mind. I have heard some of the Nuja worshippers mention the dagger. Unai leaned over the table. I believe Samin is searching for it again. Perhaps that is why she attacked Dagmar. Leora paced the tabletop. Saeed shook his head. She knows we do not have it. He leaned forward. Teza seeks the end of Nalu, and anyone who braces her power will find themselves achieving her goal. Why does she want to destroy Nalu? Vian asked. Revenge. Unai adjusted the robes over his belly. Vituko banished her from Zohar. Of course, it is more complicated, but we do not have time to get into all the details. And most of it is speculation. Saeed raised his bushy eyebrows and sat back. Samin is only the pawn, a means to an end, and in order for Teza to be released from the underworld, she would need the dagger. Unai straightened. That is where the prophecy comes into play. How did Ayianna and her family tie into all this? Kale stifled a yawn and shifted in his seat. What did the prophecy say again? He rolled its words around in his mind. Something about a star and a sacrifice and dagger. Guard the dagger. But the guardians didn't have it. Kale straightened. That had to be it. The men, after Ayianna, were searching for the dagger. He opened his mouth to speak, but Saeed raised an eyebrow, his eyes alight with Dawn's approach, and then glanced away. If we do nothing, Saeed continued, Dirk and Samin will release Teza from the underworld and ravage all of Nalu. Their destruction will be far worse than we can imagine. The prophecy warned us of this danger, and today we must face it whether or not man has provoked their own destruction. Kale glanced around the table. The guardians fell silent, their faces wrinkled in thought. The tension in the air was heavy like a great storm on the horizon, its foreboding thunderclouds building in the sky, impatient to empty its rage on the lands below. Saeed lifted his head. If Teza is released from the underworld, we, the guardians, will have failed the people of Nalu. Do not think your nations will remain unscathed from her wrath. His gaze swept over the guardians. If we refuse our responsibility, the blood of the Forsaken will be on our hands. Then when our silver cords of Zohar are cut, we will find our golden bowls smashed against the rocks, and we will be cast into the abyss. Kale stared at his dirt-encrusted nails. Was his bowl already smashed? He certainly failed enough for Vituka to remove it. He hadn't refused any of his responsibilities. He had fulfilled his duty to his father, taken care of his son and his sister, until the attack on Dagmar. What was left except to become a guardian? Would Saeed even want him now? Then his thoughts returned to Ayianna and his oath to her brother. His stomach sank. Oh, Saren, please do not let her die. I'll try harder next time. I won't fail you again. Eldwin stood. I shall carry your message to the elves. He bowed his dark face before Saeed. His thick black hair fell over his shoulders. A chorus of agreement echoed from the others, and one by one the guardian stood and strode away. Then a thought occurred to him. Saeed? Cale waited for the headmaster's gaze. Why would Sameen curse the people if she was only after the dagger? What do you do with people who are bound to your will? Cale shrugged. He heard a sharp intake of air and glanced at the prince. Vian stood. She's building an army, isn't she? Saeed nodded. He turned back to Cale. I must ask that you and your companions journey to Banpazur and find the Dwalu tonic. Cale's stomach sank even further. Great! Vian crossed his arms. We're on a child's mission while the rest of the world is preparing for battle. Young Master Vian, Saeed ambled over to the prince and gripped his shoulder. We each have a part to play in this life, and if we cannot prove trustworthy in the little parts, how can we handle the greater parts? Vian studied the headmaster. What about my father? We will do what we can to save him. Vian's shoulders slumped, and Saeed lowered his hand. I don't like it, but I will trust you. He stretched his arms and yawned. I'm beyond exhausted. Where might I rest? Leora, Saeed turned to the fairy, who was still pacing atop the table. Please show the prince where he may rest. She nodded and fluttered away, Vian in tow. Saeed gripped Cale's shoulder. Walk with me. He nodded and followed Saeed out of the courtyard, up a small hill overlooking the ruins. The pale blue sky and the fading stars stared down on them. Headmaster, I'd prefer to go alone. Saeed studied him, his gaze gentle but firm. Two fare better than one, and defeat comes slowly to a court of three, does it not? So the Thrarin says. Cale tightened his jaw. But what if the person is considered an enemy? Do you believe that one of your companions is the enemy? Saeed raised his eyebrows. His wrinkles bunched up and distorted the dark ruins on his forehead. Or is it merely a clash of differences? Cale frowned, resigned to the truth. No matter how hard he disagreed, Desmond was not the enemy. He sighed. A clash of differences. Saeed smiled faintly. Cale, you are like a son to me. Eldwin is right. Your father would have been proud of you. He placed a withered hand on Cale's shoulder. The evening after next, you and your companions will set out. Darren will see you as far as Nandari and secure supplies for your trek across the desert. Once you have what you need, meet me in Prayton, unless you are informed otherwise. Cale nodded. What about Ayianna? Do you think her father was hiding the dagger? Yes. Saeed tugged at the braids in his beard. Eloith tells me he senses an ancient evil surrounding her. The enemy knows this and is hunting her. They lapsed into silence as Cale gazed at the ruins below. So many questions tumbled in his mind. Does Sameen know where we are? Saeed shrugged. She is a sorceress now. She operates in a realm of power forbidden to us. She will go to any means to achieve her goal, and she is not concerned with the cost. So, Cale crossed his arms, you're saying we should keep a low profile? Saeed smiled. Perhaps it is divine intervention that Ayianna is here with you. Cale thought it was more like a horrible fluke of cruel circumstance. Saeed turned to go. And Cale, time is of the essence. I do not think the people can survive a length in such a binding of their wills. The curse will ultimately destroy them. If you fail, Nalu will fail, no matter if the alliance is formed. I will not fail. Saeed stared up at the approaching dawn, and Cale followed his gaze. Layers of red swelled on the eastern horizon as the sun lifted its head from slumber and disappeared into the clouds. Suddenly he was overwhelmed with gratitude for the headmaster's presence and wisdom in the difficulties soon to come. Saeed put his hand on Cale's shoulder. Your journey is perilous. Take care in whom you trust, but do not forget to trust. He nodded, despite his misgivings. Saeed smiled and squeezed his shoulder. I trust you will do fine. You will make an excellent guardian. Rest well, son of Aden. The evening comes quickly, and who knows what manner of knights you will see in the days ahead.